Annihilation of Caste is written in December 1936. Ambedkar began his public career when he came back from England. Okay? Before that, 1913 to 16, he was in Columbia University. He did his master's, did his PhD, and hurriedly he, without getting a degree, he shifted to London and enrolled himself in London School of Economics. Okay? So simultaneously he did his master's in economics in London School of Economics and was working for PhD. His scholarship given by Baroda State came to an end and he had to return. He went for a brief period. According to the contract, he had to serve Baroda State. But there he encountered the caste discrimination, like it's very classically said that even the peons used to throw piles on him. He was the secretary military to Baroda State, and still he was ill-treated. He did not get a house in Baroda and had to live in a Parsi hostel, feigning that he was upper caste. And when it was, they came to know of his caste, they threw his all things on the road, and that angered him and came back. At the end, he never went back to Baroda again, meaning not for that. Then he he came in contact with Kolhapur Shahu Maharaj, the progressive Raja. He gave some money and he started with the Mook Nayak weekly. And like that, his public life started. He went back to London to complete his PhD essay in 20. Meanwhile, he gave a testimony to South Bureau Committee in 18 and started attending conferences, etc. But he did not make up his mind really to get into public life It is said that when the Mahad organizers, the Mahad Satyagraha organizer, who was basically Comrade R.B. More, that time something like person in 20s, he was the brain behind. And when he was approached Babasaheb Ambedkar, when he came back again from London in 23, so that time Ambedkar, it is said that, it is probably not true, it is said that Ambedkar responded saying that no, I don't want to indulge into these affairs, I want to be a district judge. Now it doesn't sound plausible that such a person with all kinds of these kind of decorations of two PhDs, etc., would say so. All right, then he comes and founds the Bahishkrit Hitkarini Sabha. Okay, it's to be noted, certain things are notable, that Bahishkrit Hitkarini Sabha, entire Bahishkrit Hitkarini Sabha, the membership was our upper caste. Okay, there was no Dalit. The only executive committee of it, that means there were two things. Bahishkrit Hitkarini Sabha is the parent body, and then there is an executive committee. Executive committee, Ambedkar was chairing it, and Shiv Tarkar, another person, not of a Mahar caste, he was a Chambhar caste. That is also important, because now these identities have researched, and now one needs to differentiate how Ambedkar started off his movement. So he belonged to Chambhar caste. The next two Mahar, something like Chamar, in UP context, etc. So that was the caste. So he became a secretary. He was a secretary, and few of the Mahar then were the members. This was the composition. Then came Mahad Satyagraha, as I said, R.B. More, who became Comrade More later on, and made a mark in CPM. So he was the person behind organizing Mahat Satyagraha. Although Comrade More became communist, they remained in contact and had a mutual respect. So whenever Baba Saheb used to come back to Bombay, they used to meet. Every time they both met and discussed things. So these are certain glimpses as to the relationship between communist and the Ambedkarite, Ambedkar himself. Okay. Then Mahat Satyagraha happens. Now the evolution of Ambedkar needs to be marked. To start with, if you take a tone of Muk Nayak and take a tone of even Bahishkrut Bharat, which actually started off during the Mahat struggle, the entire thrust is something like he was imagining that if we sensitize the advanced elements of Hindu society enough, then they would come forward to undertake certain reforms in Hindu society. Okay? This part is being used by Hindutva forces today, saying that Ambedkar was not against Hinduism, he really wanted to reform Hinduism. Okay? The Mahat Satyagraha, what was Mahat Satyagraha? Basically, Mahat Satyagraha was to assert the rights of Dalits to have access to public places. Now, this access was not being demanded or fought for the first time. It existed legally already. There is in Bombay Legislative Council, there was a Bole resolution which actually was passed a couple of years before, which actually granted Dalits right to access all public places. That means public places in temples, tanks, and so on and so forth, public roads and all those. So rights existed, it was a matter of assertion, it was a matter of implementation of those rights. So there was a big depressed classes conference that they organized in Mahat and called Ambedkar to preside over. This is the way it happened. The next day, before concluding the conference, the Hindus attacked. No, these people went to Chaudhar tank. There was a tank in Mahat town. So these people went in a procession and exercised their right. They went into the tank and took water and came back. So the orthodox elements, after these people returned, they attacked them. Okay? And quite a severe attack. A lot of people actually were wounded and all those kinds of things happened. Now, all right. This conference was attended by the Mahars who had participated in the First World War. There was that area itself, many people were actually served in British military. And that was the background. All those people were the delegates to the conference. These people were totally enraged and just wanted Ambedkar not to retaliate. And it is typically described by his biographer that if Ambedkar had said just yes, they would have had it. Unfortunately, for me personally, Ambedkar said no. My book is coming in Mahat, and there I said, what if Ambedkar had said yes then? The entire course of Dalit history and entire course of Indian history would have been probably different. Okay? So this is one thing. Next, this happens in 27 March. 27 March is the first conference happened. Ambedkar is enraged, and then second conference he decides just after 8-9 months in December. And that is the consciously planned conference. The first conference, it is said, that was attended by the various figures, 3,000 to 5,000, but next conference there were more than 10,000 people, because it was a consciously planned Satyagraha conference. It was named as Satyagraha conference, and very conscious planning had been behind. So there were 10,000 people came from far-fetched areas also. It was so decided, it was all planned, so Manusmriti would be burnt and even the people would be offering Satyagraha at Chaudhar tank until it is opened. Now it could be questioned, when would the Satyagraha be withdrawn? How anyone would oppose it and how would it be concluded? So those things remains imponderable, because it becomes a folklore and people take it in face value. Just before the Satyagraha started, the orthodox elements managed a court injunction saying that this Mahat tank was not a public tank, it was a private tank. It was not a Chaudhar tank, it was a Chaudhary tank. It was manipulated, right? In my research, I found that the British collector, who was the collector of the district, he actually had prompted the people, okay, to manage this, and the injunction was obtained. This injunction, then all the conference, this becomes a focus point. The entire thing goes up. The Manusmriti, of course, is burnt. Manusmriti is burnt by a person called Sahasrabuddhe, Brahmin, and thereafter it is taken over by the Mahar saints. There used to be, I think, sadhus of Dalit caste those days. Difficult to imagine, but then thereafter they also participate in burning Manusmriti. This is the notable thing, but their entire proceeding goes on with around this injunction only, whether to carry out Satyagraha or not. The people who gather there are inclined to carry out Satyagraha, whatever that takes. There are attempts, the district collector comes and he also wants to address the people. Surprisingly, Baba Saheb Ambedkar gives him space. He addresses the delegates. Thereafter, it is so decided. People are not satisfied. He threatens that, okay, if you carry on with your resolve to offer Satyagraha, you would be actually incurring displeasure of the state. You could be arrested, say it will take action. People give a damn to him and wants to go on with Satyagraha. They said that we have come here for that purpose and we are prepared to go to jail. Ambedkar then says that, okay, this is easy to say so, but let us take a signature. And signature taking starts. Everybody starts signing. After 3,000-4,000 signatures are over, everybody wants to carry on the Satyagraha. That is stopped. Then Ambedkar himself actually addresses the people and dissuades them. It is only because of Ambedkar that people reconcile and withdraw. Okay? Meaning agree that Satyagraha would not be done. And the conference ends thereafter. And this is the end. What I am trying to say is, this is what happens. This kind of background is important. Just after this is over, this is December 27. In January 1928, in the meeting, Ambedkar starts actually talking about conversion, because he becomes totally disillusioned that any reforms in Hindu society is possible in this manner, right? And he starts talking about conversion, and he starts talking about converting to Islam. He directly says in January 1928, you become Muslims. In my area, that meeting happens, and 20 people become Musalman. They are still there. Okay? Basically, he starts thinking, starts kind of turning toward the political space that was being created, because there is a Morlamonto reforms. Before that, Morlamonto reform in 1909, then the Montague-Chelmsford reform that was slated. Then in between there is a Lucknow Pact between Muslim League and Congress. So all these kinds of things were happening on the political horizon, and he looks at the opportunity unfolding. Okay, because all kinds of the contention for share of political power was tenuously rested on the assumption that Hindus included Dalits. If Dalits said that we are not a part of Hindus, then entire balance would go bust. So that was the political opportunity he picks up, and he actually gets totally disillusioned about the temple entry, etc. People do not understand. His followers keep on doing satyagraha. Thereafter Parvati satyagraha, then Nashik satyagraha. All those satyagrahas happened, but Ambedkar is not in that. He tacitly says, okay, you carry on, kind. He does not discourage them. But he is not. His mind is not there. So initial kinds of statements about conversion, etc., could be construed as a threat to Hindus, that we are prepared to do even that. Okay? And actually sensitizing them towards what is likely to be the implication in your political arena. So this way he drives. And thereafter you would find that the Simon Commission and Simon Commission, the testimony of Simon Commission, which was actually boycotted by Congress, and on that basis, Ambedkar gets invitation to the Roundtable Conference in 31, 32. All these things are the sequence to that, right? Now, many of you know, this much probably was not known, because it still lies in Marathi. When my book comes, probably it would be opened up to the English world. But otherwise, all these kinds of things that I said are not available to non-Marathi people. Thereafter, much of it is known. In Roundtable Conference, he demands separate electorate for Dalits. Okay? And he succeeds despite the vehement opposition from Gandhi. When communal award is declared by Ramsay MacDonald, the separate electorates are given for Dalit. Gandhi sets on indefinite fast and blackmails him into agreeing with, and Pune Pact gets signed. Pune Pact, what it does is separate electorates are given up, and instead of that, far more reserved seats are offered to Dalits. Okay? So that happens. Thereafter in 30s, Ambedkar tries out to, because as it was unfolded, the 1935 Act was to, meaning this Pune Pact gets incorporated in 1935 Acts, and then the Provisional Assembly elections would happen in 1937. He floats the party in 1936 in the wake of elections, called Independent Labour Party. Okay? From 32 onward, things were totally clear that the way the politics would be unfolding itself. So there would be something like elections would happen, and electoral politics, meaning the universal franchise would slowly come in, etc. So Ambedkar wants to expand his constituency, starts eyeing to broaden it. Distinctly sees that only concentrating on Dalits or untouchables then, is not going to work. And he starts talking about talking about the entire working class. This independent party veritably become the first left party in India. Although Communist Party comes into being in 20s, but independent party, you'll have to acknowledge that communists then either were working clandestinely or as a socialist bloc under Congress cover. Okay? So legally it was difficult for communists to operate. So independent party is the first labor party as such to have been formed in 30s. This is the first left party of India. One should acknowledge. And he declares that Brahminism and capitalism were the duo enemy of Dalits. Entire 30s, if you find that he comes very close to the left, to communist. And he tries to extend hands to the communist. But that part we will see later. Now 35 in between, there is sort of many strands of Ambedkar that you have to discern, and probably they do not cohere well. While he talks the entire leftist language, the Independent Labour Party is again as a kind of replica of Independent Labour Party in London, which was actually the Fabian Party. Its manifesto almost mirrors theirs. It does not have a word caste. You would be surprised that many people ascribe that Ambedkar only worked for caste, etc. Independent Labour Party, the first party of Ambedkar, does not have a word caste. It only occurs once, and that too passingly. It does not have any influence. And it talks about, when Times of India interviews him, he describes it that it's a workers' party. Okay? When later Stafford Cripps' mission comes to India and to sort of decide and talk to the various community leaders to seek their support for the British war efforts, that time they are reluctant because to speak to Ambedkar, and his Stafford Cripps tells Ambedkar that in what capacity I talk to you, because you describe yourself as a workers' leader. Actually, my terms of reference is to talk about the communal leader, because they always maintain that as the British policy to imagine India to be the bunch of communities, and they actually maintain that. So they said that what way kind of I talk to you, and this really actually prompts Ambedkar to dissolve ILP, Independent Labour Party, and form seemingly the caste party, Scheduled Caste Federation. Okay, so this happens of course in 42. We are we want it to be in 36 only. These are the kinds of background when he gets an invitation from Jat-Pat Todak Mandal, Lahore, to preside over their conference, annual conference. This is the annihilation of caste is nothing but the speech that Ambedkar writes to be delivered as a presidential speech in that conference. So the organizers want him to send a copy before, so Ambedkar sends it, and they find some problem with the certain paras, and they request that be deleted. Ambedkar does not agree. As a result, later they cancel the conference. So annihilation of caste is the undelivered speech in the conference which was never held. Ambedkar publishes it, and it creates quite a stir. Now what is there in this is the background, because this is the context now in which this thing needs to be read. Just before year 35 in Yevle there is a conference, and wherein Ambedkar declares that although I was born in Hindu, I couldn't help, but I would never die a Hindu. Okay? That again creates a big problem, Because all said and done, even his disciples were not prepared to give up the religion. So there is a lot of furor and turbulence in the movement itself, which necessitates calling a big conference in Bombay in 1936, just before he starts writing this speech. There he explains the rationale for his declaration. He starts off, it's very important, and again his English translation is available on internet, but in Marathi the title was Mukti Kon Pathe, which way the deliverance. Okay, and this is the conference supposed to be of activists of Ambedkarite movement then. He starts off saying, and it's like a class teacher, school teacher. He explains systematically and why he said so and all that thing. So he starts off with atrocities on Dalit. So atrocity on Dalits, he says it's not atrocity, but something like anybody can walk in, slap you and get away. Why does it happen? So he reasons out it is because of your weakness. That you do not have a strength of numbers because you are a minority in any village, okay? You do not have the financial strength, that means you do not have money also, and you do not have moral strength. Having lived for hundreds of years as slaves, you have imbibed that slavish mentality, so you do not have moral strength also. Then he contrasts it with Muslims. He says that Muslims also place similarly, demographically similar, because they are never majority anywhere. But nobody would dare to touch them, because they know if anybody is touched anywhere, Muslims from Kashmir to Kanyakumari could come to support them, and Hindus would have it. So clearly the tone was that we should actually emulate something like become Musliman or something. Because his diagnosis also leads to how do you overcome this weakness? Simplistically, he says that by merging into some existing religious community. Now, which were the existing religious communities then? Muslims and Christians and Sikhs, of course. Christians he was never inclined for whatever reason, but Muslims he always talked about, and thereafter Sikhs also came in. Sikhs I never talked about, but he actually afterward he sent a team to Amritsar, which remained his, and my father-in-law was a part of it. Kind. Okay. So this happens. So this is the background in which he writes. So it's a very, very vehement kind of text, and he actually makes it very comprehensive. And as it comes to that, it's very clear. At the end he says that as for me, I have decided to go out. I wish you well. Now how does it starts off? It starts off with something like a social reform and political reform, because these questions were hanging in the air, okay? And the upper class or non-Dalit kind of arena, this was a question which hung in the air. There was a national movement which was actually demanding political freedom from colonial rule, and there were the groups which actually hampered upon the social thing. So when the Congress came into being in 85, that time itself, this duality happened in Congress. The Congress accommodated for quite some time. The social conference used to happen. Whenever the Congress conference happened, the part of it used to be social conference. So they were distinctly, these two things were going parallel. But thereafter, when it came into Pune, the first time Tilak did not allow their pandals to be used, and they drove them out. So this happened. And even those who were on a political side, they never actually relished this idea that anything of this kind should be tried out. Ambedkar cites W.C. Banerjee, who was a president of Allahabad Congress conference, saying that how does it matter that our daughters do not go to colleges, schools, or our widows are burnt on this thing. What has it got to do with the political freedom? So such kind of statements, etc. There are plenty of such citations, etc. Ambedkar provides. There he explains systematically that how social change is important, more important than the political change. How social freedom, so to say, or social reforms are more important than political. He uses these kinds of words, reforms, social reforms and political reforms also. Political reforms meaning something like getting Swaraj or freedom from British rule. So firstly he explains that point, that how social reforms are more important than political reform, because unless society bears it and actually internalizes it, the political reforms will not be successful. That is what is contention. Now he brings in, it actually frames in a broader framework and makes the point. He brings in something like, he, let me say so, that he initially itself classifies in two camps, two parts. Who are the people who are opposed to social reforms? One is the nationalist stream, those kinds of people, all Congress who were actually hampering upon political freedom from British. One. Second thing is socialist. Ambedkar, because there was no tribe that existed as a socialist, actually they were the communist. But Ambedkar always uses as socialist to them. So they were also opposed, right? So nationalist, I said what their contention was, and but socialist he deals with. They say that, and it still goes on, that if the revolution happens, then automatically all these social problems should be taken care. Correct? Marxists have that, they use it base and superstructure kind of metaphor of Marx. Okay? And with this, they still hamper upon that actually if a proletariat revolution happens here, then all these problems should be taken care. Now they do not say, earlier time they used to say almost kind of automatically it would be taken care. Now there is over the 7 decades, probably there is an improvement saying that there is nothing like automatism. You may have to work for that. But still, the base and superstructure holds good. So then Ambedkar contends and makes it a broader frame that in history, always political reforms are preceded by the social reforms. And he gives an example of Rome and all kinds of things down to Shivaji. Shivaji's political revolution is preceded by the Bhakti movement, for instance, the social movement in Maharashtra. How apt are these examples, etc., are different point. But this is the way he contends that the point is, and the valid point perhaps even today is, that base and superstructure kind of metaphor, somebody imagines that without tinkering with social sphere, if somebody imagines that political change can be brought in, it might appear that the political change comes, but it would never last. So that ground needs to be prepared for that. There has to be something like a dialectical relationship. Ambedkar does not use this language, but there is a dialectical relationship between all these kinds of spheres. You do not imagine that things happen automatically. So that meaning could be derived from the entire thing. Then there are certain kinds of he says in relation to this would be important because he makes many kinds of such points in relation to Marxist. Never uses Marxist as a word or communist as a word. They are all grouped together under socialist. Why I am saying so is that ultimately these are our Dalit belong to the same class, and we'll have to pay attention to what is happening to the other camp. The emancipation of Dalit cannot happen if the people of your class themselves are not actually accepting that kind of project. Okay, that I would come later. So he says that something like communists hamper upon the economic kind of thing. And economic power is not the only thing. There is social and religious power, etc. All those kinds of things that it's the same thing saying that you have to take it together and things like that. The Ambedkar says actually Ambedkar in a way gets into trap of that base and superstructure kind of metaphor. Okay, that when Marxists say that that the revolution in base needs to be carried out and superstructure would follow, so he could have said that both needs to be tackled simultaneously, but as though he accepts that metaphor and contend that no, firstly superstructural revolution ought to happen, then the base thing can be taken up. Okay, so it's a kind of trap that needs to be discerned. Then in the same contention he explains the kind of theories, the caste is nothing but a division of labor, and he says that it is not division of labor, because meaning division of labor is a natural kind of economic organization anywhere, but this is not a natural thing. It's a division of laborers. Okay, that everybody is fixed in its position, so it is not mere division of labor, but it is a division of laborers, and there is no mobility at all to the people belonging to the caste. So that point. Then it deals with something like people bring in the racial theory. Okay, that these people belong to different castes or the races, the racial division. So he dismisses that and clarifies that there is nothing like racial division. There is no basis for biological basis for the caste. Okay, so he actually comprehensively deals with the caste question and says that there is no similarity between the North Indian Brahmin and the Brahmin in the South. and the vice versa, or something like a Punjabi Dalit and the Tamil Nadu Dalit, for instance. There is nothing like a racial similarity or anything. So that's the answered thing. The contemporary relevance of which could be to the people who actually contend, those Moola Nivasis, etc. There is a palpable movement of the educated people who contend that we are different stock, this Aryan theory and this and that and all, and they are trying to articulate that into something like a Moola Nivasi. We are the aboriginal people out here and have to fight and drive out Aryan. So Ambedkar never stood for. So that is the contemporary revolution, relevance of what Ambedkar said in Annihilation of Caste. Ambedkar did not mean, now that needs to be understood, the Ambedkar did not mean all these projects as an identitarian project, that we emancipate. That did not mean that we actually capture the power and reverse the scale, that we would enslave now others. Okay, they have enslaved us for years, now it is our turn to enslave them. He never meant that, not only Annihilation of Caste, but elsewhere also, until his thing. He talked about emancipation and evolve rather. This I gave some glimpse of his evolution up to 30s, but later on also he went on evolving, and actually his views went on broadening kind of thing. When he says thereafter something like a very universal kind of language, universal emancipation kind of language he starts using at towards end. It's a different matter that he actually finds it in something like a solace in Buddhism and things like that. But that point needs to be noted, that he did not want to just reverse the scale of oppression or exploitation. There are many more details that he actually goes to explain these kinds of points. And he deals with many things that were going on, like Arya Samaj had undertaken Shuddhi and Sanghatan. Okay, so he comments on that, like Shuddhi and Sanghatan are impossible with caste being around, because he takes a clue from what the Shastras say about the caste. There are divisions, etc. So how could you be carrying out Shuddhi? Okay, because it basically, unless you abolish caste, there could not be Shuddhi and thereafter Sanghatan. So that he actually goes on disproving all these kinds of patchy attempts that were initiated by the reformists. Then he keeps on describing something like there is nothing like with caste being around, there is nothing like public. For Hindus, the public is a caste. There is nothing, meaning there can't be any public for Hindu than caste. So everything is divided, because that becomes, caste constitutes their universe. So that kind of thing actually, basically it's an elaboration, systematic elaboration of all contemporary thoughts that were in offing, and sort of refuting them that this is not going to happen. The entire thrust is that unless the castes are eradicated, unless the castes are annihilated, till then all those kinds of things should not happen. That is basically his point. And this way the text runs. So Ambedkar explains that how this is not possible, that Varnashram Dharma is the basic source of the caste, and how caste cannot be abolished with Varnashram Dharma kept intact. This could be extended later. Actually, that point he has not dealt with, that the reformers thereafter started saying, particularly after these political developments came, Lucknow Pact of 1916 between things, the Congress became very sensitive about this Dalit factor. Gandhi returns from South Africa in 1915, and 1916 he addresses one of the meetings. 1 year he actually travels around the country and tries to understand. He goes and lives with Rabindranath Tagore, and their discussion takes place. Rabindranath Tagore also educates him that the caste is a factor that needs to be taken care. And whatever Gandhi understands, he actually comes back to Ahmedabad, and first time from the Congress platform, he talks about eradicating untouchability. Now this becomes a palpable factor. Annihilation of caste does not deal with that kind of thing yet, although it happens in 1916, many years before. So most reformers, right from the first reformer, like the English educated elite kind of Raj Ram Mohan Roy Jenner, they always talked about untouchability, because in relation to British, the Westerners, actually untouchability kind of custom embarrasses them. So they want to do away with, but never anybody talked about the caste. Even Gandhi's tone also is that the castes are okay. Castes are okay. and he sources it anyway from Varnashram Dharma, which is actually part of the Sanatan Dharma. The castes are okay, he defends caste, but untouchability ought to go. Now later on, this comes up to even the constitution later on, because we have to bring it to and relate it to the contemporary things, what this thing has done to our own times. So in constitution also untouchability easily gets outlawed. Okay, they abolish untouchability, but the castes are preserved with an alibi that state has to do social justice to the lower caste. Okay, so there is a link like that. So although annihilation of caste does not deal with these kinds of things, but this varnashram versus the caste, etc., could be brought in to bear upon this kind of division between caste and untouchability. Because like Ambedkar's contention, the castes were integral part of Varnashram Dharma. Varnashram Dharma was the source of that. And likewise, untouchably was just an aspect of caste. So later on, when people actually hampered upon abolishing untouchability, they needed to abolish caste. The same argument could be applied to the caste. But unfortunately, this happens, and in constitution, untouchability gets outlawed, not caste. Caste rather are pickled with a alibi, with a pretext that state wanted a space to do social justice, nothing but reservations. And there are a lot of references that you would find that what damage this caste has caused to India as a whole. That entire history of Hindus is nothing but the history of defeat. How it has really given us the history of slavery and things like that. So there are many such references. That entire text runs around these points. Then, of course, at the end, he comes to the core question, how to abolish caste. Firstly, more than half of the text, actually, he tries to establish that how castes are bad and how India progress cannot be possible without abolition of caste. So that's the point he makes. So he marshals lot many historical data, lot many facts, lot many statements, lot many citations, etc., to come to the point that there has to be a project of abolition of caste. Now, how do you do that? That he comes to. Now, the diagnosis of Ambedkar is that he says that in order to abolish caste, the reformist people have lot many solutions like interdining, intermarrying, etc. Okay, the Arya Samaj actually carries out those kinds of things. Then all the Hindu reformists, etc., have interdining across caste, and those kinds of movements were on. So Ambedkar deals with that. He says that interdining is no solution. When it comes to intermarriage, he finds a solution. Okay. But then he says that intermarriage could be a solution. Okay, read it carefully. But why people would not be ready to intermarry across caste? How people would not be ready to marry? So he actually finds a virtue in inter-caste marriages, because there would be intermingling of blood and the sort of all relations of kind, etc., would change, and this kind of consciousness would be dissolved. So he distinctly finds that intermarriages could be a solution, but then takes it up that why people would not be ready to intermarry. And this he then reasons it out that people would not be ready to intermarry because of the influence of the religion. Okay, influence of the Shastras on their mind. The Shastras do not allow. Okay, so that kind of thing. And then he systematically comes, what is the then way of doing this? So abolish or destroy these Shastras. Okay, destroy your religion, destroy your Shastras. So unless that is done, the caste annihilation may not be possible. That is what he contends. Now further up he goes and says, because it would sound like destroy your religion, but Ambedkar does not want to say that. It's very interesting how what kind of core he had. So he does not want to give up religion. He wants religion be there, but destroy this religion of rules. Now he tries to divide Hindu religion into two. Now this again, the contemporary relevance of it is to give feed to the Hindutva forces. Okay? He divides Hinduism into two streams. One is the Hinduism of Shastras, Puranas, Smritis, etc. Okay, which actually gives, it's something like a rule book for the Hindus, that you have to do such thing, you have to do such thing, you have to do this thing. Ambedkar contended that religion should be principles, not rules. He divided between these two things. Okay, and there is a bunch of things which are available as the principles for Hinduism also. What is that? Upanishads. So he says that probably the Upanishads could be, Upanishad ordained religion could be the religion for people. This is the exact strand Hindutva forces now pick up. That we are prepared, they say, to abolish caste. They would never say explicitly that we are ready to dynamite Shastras, Purans, Smritis, etc. as Ambedkar wanted, to abolish the rule-based religion and adopt the principle-based religion. Now that part goes fluid, okay, that part goes hazy, that they would not speak in those language. But this actually becomes a thread to the extent that support their statement that Ambedkar did not want to destroy Hindu religion and he wanted a reform in Hinduism. So the root lies there. Now he comes to the practicability of destroying the Shastras. He said the dynamite Shastras. Would the Brahmins come forward to do that? Because Brahmins are the custodians of the Shastras, etc. And would they be prepared to dynamite the Shastras, which actually give them all social privileges? Answer is no. Okay? Ambedkar severely says elsewhere that when the conflict comes in history, whenever the conflict came in history between ethics and economic always prevailed. Ambedkar said here in Alienation of Caste that no ruling class would easily give up his privileges. No Brahmin would easily come forward to destroy Shastra, which is the source of his privilege. That he says it aloud. And that is why he says that as for me, I think that this is an impossible project. You people could be variously working for that. Do continue. You will have my sympathies. You will have my support. But as for me, I have decided to go out. So this refers to his Yavla declaration that he would never die Hindu. Okay? And text ends there. Yeah? So now what do we construe? If this is so, that ruling class or caste or whosoever it is never gives up his privileges, just like that. And just as I said that if the ethics and economic conflict always goes in favor of economics, ultimately economics favors, then it comes to that the force becomes the midwife of the change, social change, which is what Marx said. It was not a violence but a force. Actually, somebody, Bukharin, translated into a violence. That was a mistranslation. Otherwise, it was a force. I'm just hinting at things. I would invite your questions now because I just wanted to introduce the text. And this is perhaps I have been truthful to the text, and this is presented as a gist. Rest we could discuss. Now, what could be the implications of that and to our contemporary world? Because certain traits I have let bare that the certain question that we may have to ask ourselves whether castes are really rooted. Ambedkar's time in 1936, probably yes. It might have appeared so. But today, if we are confronting caste, are these castes rooted in the Hindu Dharma Shastras? That we may have to ask ourselves. To what extent these castes are rooted in Hindu Shastra? To what extent these castes are rooted in Constitution? Okay? Which they wanted to preserve. This is the important question that needs to be asked. To what extent annihilation caste provide the blueprint to abolish caste, and to what extent it does not? Okay? To what extent there is a agency of force in abolition of caste, and to what extent the constitutionalism could achieve that? So these are the pertinent questions probably to grapple with. So as an historical document, the most important thing, and which is very venerable to me, is that until then nobody talked about annihilation of caste. And this is the first time this came to the surface. And that's the biggest contribution of Ambedkar. It is not important that he gives us a blueprint or he is actually right in all that. It is most important that he gives or actually puts annihilation of caste onto the agenda of India. So that is the most important thing. And most pertinent question that follows, the $1 million question that follows, is whether today's Dalits are really adhering to this kind of program that Ambedkar said, when they call themselves or claim themselves to be Ambedkarite. I stop here. I welcome your questions.